We will start with the New Zealand Warriors wildcard, who will not be playing this weekend because it's another week. It's the 28th that the NRL comes back. But we do have... shit's kind of hitting the fan for the Warriors. Injury-wise, I think you had Jazz Tavanga go down injured. Recently, we've also had Adam Kieran. I think there was another forward who... Listener Mao was out long-term, so I find this interesting from a training perspective. It's hard to correlate those injuries directly to the new head of athletic performance, Mr. Craig Twentyman, but just an interesting assessment here, especially when that's compounded with such dour performances in those first few rounds. So we can talk about the injuries and any training ideas, or not training ideas as in we're going to write a training plan, but just thoughts and ideas around that stuff with Craig Twentyman and all these injuries and how they're training. Also, the Warriors are reported to be signing Cronulla Sharks forward Toby Rudolph, along with Ben Murdoch-Masila for next season. So neither of them are going to help the Warriors this season when they need lots of forwards, but in appearing to sign those two lads, I've kind of scouted out a bit of a pivot in the Warriors forward pack style, and I think that opens it up to the wider Warriors roster as well. So let's get into a bit of New Zealand Warriors here, wildcard. You can pick any of those little yarns to move forward from. But I think it's an interesting time to talk about the Warriors moving forward, setting the scene for the club at the moment, going into next week when they will get back on the NRL field, and that's kind of the only sport we're going to have to watch. So we can take a bit of time just to set up some Warriors yarns and narratives here. So what tickles your fancy from that blurb?
Well, there's another aspect that you didn't mention as well, which is that their first game back is against my very own Dragons. So a little bit of what would you call it, the niche cast derby, I suppose you could say. First up, we talked a little bit about forward packs and directions of that last week, but I think that the continuing injuries thing is probably the factor that catches me the most from all that, because it's something that I think a lot of sports have been a little bit quite wary of at the moment, and you see this in let's start with, for example, on the weekend I stayed up nice and late and managed to watch a replay or two as well of some of the Bundesliga stuff coming back. I wanted to see how they handled it, how it was going, what the product was like. I found product is a horrible word to use about sport, actually. I apologize for that, but I found the games pretty bloody entertaining. I thought the standard of footy was decent. But one thing that was quite interesting in hearing people who follow the Bundesliga a lot more closely than I do, pointing out how the pace was down, and they attributed that a lot to just the lack of fans sort of taking away that kind of heightened high pressure atmosphere, and there's less arguing with referees and stuff like that as well. It's actually kind of all a welcome change. There was kind of a chillness to the way the game was played, but without it being without it feeling like it was low stakes. There was still points to be won for every one of those teams and all that. But one of the cheeky things that I hadn't noticed, but which got pointed out a few times during all those games, was that there's a little bit of a FIFA exemption at the moment where you can make, and I assume it must be across all leagues, but you can make 5 subs now just on a temporary basis. So they say you're not allowed to make more than 3 substitution what do you even call it, at a time. You're only allowed to make 3 little blocks for substitutions, but you can make 5 in total, so you can make a couple double subs to get to 5 sort of thing. And the reason they've done that is because they're worried about injuries and workloads for players who have been, in the middle of their season and then away from the season and not able to train properly for a while. And this is one of the reasons that, one of many reasons that the English Premier League's having a tough time coming back around, because players don't want to, and the NBA actually as well, I've seen similar things from there. Like, players don't want to come straight back, have a week of training and be right into it. Like, they're worried about injuries, they're worried about fitness and all those things. They actually want a bit of time to like work up into games. I wonder if that's a factor here with the Warriors, who obviously had a very disjointed start to the season for reasons out of their control, and now just a lot of like not quite knowing what's going on and just kind of having to take it day by day and all that. And now they're back into full-time training over in Australia, and suddenly there's been like 3 rather serious, relatively long-term injuries, So I suspect that's not a coincidence, and I suspect as well it's probably going to be something that all teams are going to have to deal with, because everyone's in the same situation as far as that kind of stuff goes. It's the Warriors are a little bit worse because of the traveling away and all that, but like every team had that extended amount of time away from training as a unit, as a group, and are having to pick that straight back up, and then within less time than you'd normally have for a regular preseason, they've got to be back into like the middle of the season form kind of thing. So it's I kind of feel that's something that we're going to see relatively commonly throughout 2020, probably not just in NRL and football, probably across all sports as well.
The difference with the Warriors is that prior to the season happening and prior to any news of the pandemic was the fact that all the injuries were still there. So prior to the season starting, you had Bunty Afoa with a major knee injury. You had Jackson Frey with a major knee injury. Let me just check the full stuff here. And they were the big ones. I'll just update this as I roll through the news. So you had Jackson Frey and Bunty Afoa both suffer major knee injuries prior to the season starting, and then the other stuff starts to pile on top. So I think there was another major knee injury. You had 3. Just can't remember off the top of my head. So with the Warriors, it was a case of, and the reason I find this so interesting is because there's the backstory of Alex Corvo being with the Warriors, and then there being apparently some sort of player revolt against Alex Corvo by like just connecting the dots of what's been said. The players came up with this idea that Alex Corvo's training wasn't, doing it for them, and that led to Alex Corvo losing his job and not continuing. That led to Craig Twentyman coming on board, who has a fairly solid history with the Australian Sevens program. And then we got the stuff, the information about the Warriors players, the leadership group wanting to change the style of play, wanting to change the quote-unquote game model, and I viewed that as all being part of one thing, one issue, or one little conundrum for the Warriors. And then recently I went back and watched one of their preseason video things that they had, the one where Cameron George had his speech, and other than the very strange line that he repeated twice of "the power will be outstanding," which didn't actually manifest into anything.
Sounds like Darth Vader.
Yeah, it was a bit weird, but he had a throwaway line in there about players, how it's no good that the players come speak up after the season's finished. And remember that this came out during like around early November, and so he was making a point that if anything's wrong, you got to speak up, we got to communicate, we got to make our ideas clear. So I connect those dots, and I have this feeling or this thought that late in the season, the senior players went to Warriors leadership and they voiced their concerns with the approach to fitness and their style of footy, which saw this 20-man dude come in, and then we not only had a large... it's hard to... I don't want to word it so it's like directly related to 20-man, but there was... and I don't know... I don't have statistics as to whether X amount of major season-ending injuries or long-term injuries is above average or below average, but there was a collection of major injuries prior to the season starting, after their off-season training, and then came the 2 games that they did play where the Warriors blatantly looked slow. The Warriors blatantly looked unenergetic. And sure, some of that is our quintessential Warriors attitude and culture and mental toughness and all of that stuff, but it's also just physically. They didn't look like professional zip. There was no buzz. There was no pizzazz about how they were moving. They looked slow. They looked sluggish. And we had all the injuries. And now that's just merely continued. And I get your point that, yeah, I definitely agree that there's going to be some niggly stuff in terms of quality of play and the dangers to athletes, and let alone in a full contact sport. Like you're talking about Bundesliga football and NBA players. It's a different kettle of fish when your job is running into dudes, and so you not only have to have the aerobic fitness, the cardio, you've also got to be conditioned for contact with other 100 kg blokes. So definitely every team's going to be in that shitty situation where it's kind of high risk for the players if they have stepped away from any professional training regime. But for the Warriors, they just keep getting injured, and they also looked to be lacking in speed and fitness. So I think it's a very interesting observation to make, because we never really ponder the physical training of these professional clubs. Like we don't put a focus on it, but we're seeing, I don't know if this is a definitive judgment on Craig Twentyman, but we're just seeing a few things emerge that don't necessarily reflect positively on his training methods.
Yeah, that's some high quality sleuthing from you there to connect them dots. That's real interesting, because that kind of like old mate Corvo came over from, was it the Broncos, I think, and wherever he came from, he had like a reputation of being a hard man, like the dude who was going to whip the Warriors into shape. And it was probably a little while there, maybe was it the start of 2 seasons ago where they I think he was there that whole time. But anyway, like whether it looked like maybe they had brought more fitness and they were lasting 80 minutes and all this, and then they I'm working anecdotally here, so I'm pretty sure my timelines are aligned, but they might not be. Correct me if I'm getting things wrong. But they had like a nice run to start the season where they had a bunch of wins and a good record, and then they sort of tailed off the rest of the way and became regular old Warriors. And that's one of those things where it's like, because it's easy to look at this now and say, oh, the Warriors maybe, like, to connect a few extra dots that maybe aren't there, and say like, oh, the Warriors senior players just didn't like working so hard. They got rid of the tough guy, brought in someone else, and now they're unfit again, and blah, blah, blah. Like, that's probably that's definitely unfair, because we're talking about professional athletes here. But, like, there's different types of fitness and different like, there's, in that Last Dance documentary as well, early on, there's a bit about how Michael Jordan, after a while, felt like when they first lost to the Pistons in the late 80s, I think, and he felt like he was getting bullied and pushed around, he started doing more weights to bulk up a bit more. Like, there's just a balance between those kind of things, and it's not just about being fit or unfit. It's fit in what areas, fit in like what balance kind of thing. And if you go extra hard in preseason and, you know, running marathons in the first 2 months of the seasons, you'll find yourself very quickly tiring as well and not able to last a full season, because it's just too much of a toll on your body. There's a manager who's in football who's at Leeds United at the moment, Marcelo Bielsa, who's an Argentinian fella. He's had good success in like France, and he's been all around the place. I think Italy for a while, and he's one of those guys who's a hugely influential manager. Like Pep Guardiola would have like they'd talk for hours on end about stuff. Pochettino was a big disciple of his as well, and but Bielsa also has a kind of tendency for because he expects he's tactically a genius. He's super innovative and all this, but what he expects of his players for that kind of like high pressing intensity of football, he has a tendency of not winning trophies as well, because the trophies are won at the end of the season, and he's one of those guys who seems to be like the guy who's close but not quite close enough, because his teams famously fade over the course of years as well. Even Leeds did that last season, where they looked like they were odds on for promotion, couldn't hold on to it over the back half of the season. At the moment, there isn't no back half of the season. Not sure actually what's happening with Championship football. There's no New Zealanders in that division this season for once as well, unfortunately. But that's an example of how that can work, where you do too much fitness and suddenly it doesn't work. And then someone like I think Arsene Wenger is probably another one who could have a similar kind of thing in terms of injuries, because those great Arsenal teams, a lot of brittle players, a lot of players that suffered a lot of injuries, and Wenger's very famous for bringing in at a time as well, like when the Premier League was first getting into towards where it is now in terms of its global importance and all that, and he was bringing in like new dietary things and sports science elements, and there was sometimes a tendency that or a reputation that he had just like beneath everything else, because undoubtedly like massively successful manager who had some fantastic teams, but also a lot of players who had a lot of injuries, and there was a bit of a criticism that they would overthink those kind of things, and players would get injured because they were trying too hard not to get injured, and maybe some of his sports science things had a tendency to tip the scales too much in the other direction, and so instead of being unfit, suddenly they're just always injured and things like that. A couple of different examples there anyway, and I'm not sure exactly which. I don't know. Do you have like a feel or an instinct of what we're talking about, like specifically with the Warriors, and like are they just is it too easy to say that they're not as fit as they should be, or that perhaps they're trying too hard to be too fit, or like do you have a feeling for that kind of thing, and how that specifically is leading to this situation where they underperformed drastically in the first couple of weeks, and now suddenly, well, not suddenly, but throughout the whole time have been chipping away with rather unfortunate injuries the whole time?
It's a very interesting thought, because as far as general on-field performances go, they're like, obviously it's a 2-game stretch, maybe a 6 to 7 month stretch for Craig Twentyman in this job, so small sample size alert there. But other than that 5-6 round period, what was it, the start of 2018 that you mentioned, I don't see any difference in the Warriors' performance from Corvo to Twentyman. Like, in terms of how they play their footy and what they do, well, no, more so how they go on the field. Like, do they win games or lose games? Between Alex Corvo and Craig Twentyman, nothing's changed. There's no difference in their quality as a football team. Like, they just still feel like a 10th place NRL team at best. But as far as what I know about like the training, again, connecting dots, I'm not an expert on this, but we know from his history that Alex Corvo is very much about volume. He was with the Melbourne Storm, and I don't know if he went from the Melbourne Storm to the Broncos, but he was definitely with the Melbourne Storm for a long time. Worked with Stephen Kearney. Obviously, Stephen Kearney's got a great connection with the Storm, and also has a connection with Alex Corvo at the Broncos, where they worked together before coming to the Warriors. And Corvo was all about volume. Corvo is all about mental toughness through just doing the work and setting that base, setting that foundation. Whereas in a couple of videos, the players have said that 20-min stuff is more based around power and the short, sharp bursts. I think one of the all-in videos, I haven't looked at them all for a couple of months, so it's hard to remember, but 20-min did break down like his training methods, and there was like that. The Warriors low-key did share out stuff that was like, we're doing things differently this year. Whether it was Stephen Kearney saying that the senior players came to him to change the game model, whether it was in one of their videos they're running up a hill in Auckland, like they're doing their hill training, and Craig 20-min's narrating it, breaking it down, like this is why we're doing it, this is how we're doing it, and so on. And my general vibe is that Corvo was all about volume and mental toughness through that volume, whereas Craig 20-min is more about speed, but like the agility and the power, and kind of just focusing on that. Maybe you can differentiate it between an old school and a new school. I'm not sure. But that's just my feeling, which then resulted in the exact same like performances. So that's that. While you were speaking, I did find a bigger list of the injuries. So Bunty Afoa, Jackson Frey, and Tane Milne all did major knee injuries prior to the season starting. And then over the last week or so, we've had Lisana Mau with his pec. Jazz Tavanga and Adam Kieran have both had knee injuries. I just don't know if they're the major season-ending knee injuries. So of those 6 players, 5 of them have knee injuries. And Jazz Tavanga's, I think he had an ankle injury. He might have had ankle surgery late last year or during the off season. Was due to come back early this season, and then he's got a knee. So you've kind of got these guys who are often injured, like Nathaniel Roach, and Jazz Tavanga picks up injuries all the time. But just in like this bubble of 2020, 6 major injuries and 5 of them are knees. So that's just straight up. That's the fact. And I'm not sure. Like it's hard to draw connections on how that reflects well or bad on people, but if you're Craig 20-min and you're seeing this, it's like, oh shit, like what's going on?
Yeah, and that's one of those like you can't just like point the finger at one person or even one aspect or any because there's same with anything, like there's just enough stuff happening from all directions to kind of like cloud the to the reasoning. I mean, it's never a case of one specific thing anyway, unless it's a freak injury. Injuries tend to be like a result of sustained grinding kind of pressure sort of thing. And one injury leads to another injury, and injury-prone players are going to continue to be injury-prone if they go through the same kind of motions, and then you have the stop-and-start nature of the league this year, and then you have the different training regime and the different style of play, and like there's just a lot of things in that mixing pot, which lead to different things. It did sort of get me thinking a little bit about training in general, and I mean, you see apologies for keeping going back to that Chicago Bulls documentary, but it's in my mind at the moment. Like Dennis Rodman skipping out on training and stuff, and then turning up and laying it down at game time, sort of thing. Like sometimes the training can be a bit overrated. Sometimes it can be completely underrated. I think the point is that the training has to serve the game. Like in this case, the 80 minutes of NRL footy each week. The training has to serve that rather than coming at the detriment of that, which sometimes it can do if you get too in deep, like too like down in the trenches about it all. And other times, of course, it can be the opposite, to where you don't train enough, and therefore it like a little bit more training, a little bit more work in certain areas, be they tactical, mental, physical, whatever, will massively improve the way that you can perform in those 80 minutes. And it's finding that balance, I suppose, of those things. And sometimes when you got this big functional unit, sometimes dysfunctional unit of a club, like not just a team, but a whole club, and you've got a guy who's in charge of this area, a guy who's in charge of this area, guys in charge of that area, and everyone wants to do their jobs as well as they can. And sometimes, I don't know, sometimes I wonder if they're not, I'm not pointing fingers at the Warriors here specifically either. I'm talking in general about all sport. Like sometimes maybe they don't work in harmony with each other, all those different elements of a professional sports club. Just a thought I was having during all that.
Definitely. And I think obviously I'm not a professional athlete, nor am I a professional trainer, but the one thing I always think about is just what's if an NRL club just decided to have a cruisier summer schedule? Like what's if an NRL club just looked at some numbers and did some research and went down the route of, okay, like all these other teams flog themselves over summer, apparently, like this, like everyone says it's to prepare you for a season and you need to have the 2 to 3 months over summer preparing you for the rigors of an NRL season. What's if an NRL team just kind of went about it in a different manner and was like more about making sure that players are fresh, that they're rested, that they are in a great space health-wise. Obviously, you've got to be fit enough to be a professional athlete. But it's just the tension between like every NRL club prides themselves on, this is the toughest preseason we've had. It's oh my gosh, like it's such a rigor. Like that's all you hear about in January and February with regards to NRL off-season training. What's if there was an NRL team who was just like, maybe we don't necessarily need to go have the toughest off-season, preseason training schedule, and it's more about just ensuring that the guys are ready, but they're also ready to go 26 rounds at least and have the bulk of our best players available. Because as soon as you get injuries, that's your best players become unavailable, quality of your roster just decreases. So the Warriors roster right now, like they've got 6 of their top 30 who are unavailable. What makes that worthwhile? What makes whatever you're doing over the summer worthwhile that you lose 6 of your not best players, but like at least 4 of those players are top 17 players. So I just have this weird idea, like, but then you look at, like, my favorite NRL team is the Melbourne Storm because they're the best. They've got a great relationship with Aotearoa as well. You look what they do for off-season training, it's fucking crazy. It's hectic. It's tough. It's rugged. And they are successful. And they also, just straight off the top of my head, like I don't really hear about Melbourne Storm players suffering numerous knee injuries. So like as we've discussed numerous times, like we'll just copy what the Melbourne Storm's doing, which kind of poos in the face of my idea of like maybe it's just better to have a relaxed off season and prepare you. I don't know, but it's a bit convoluted, different strokes for different folks. Not sure if you got anything else to add to that discussion.
Well, it's an interesting thought experiment, Because like all that stuff they talk about, like we do this hard work because it's to get that 1% of extra difference, and that's obviously just a cliche. But what if you actually measured it and found that being that much fitter allowed you 1% of difference? Would you be like, well, can we find 2% of improvement somewhere else at the expense of that extra 1%? It's not saying you come in unfit. It's just saying that you don't absolutely flog the lads for the entirety of preseason kind of thing, like everyone claims to do. I mean, the NRL is ruthless. You got to be at an extremely high level of fitness just to survive anyway. So the benchmark that we're talking about isn't like me turning up after 6 weeks of lockdown, not even leaving the house out of like most of those days, like that's obviously not the benchmark minimum that we're talking about with an NRL player. There's certain extreme levels of fitness you get into anyway. It's just like, I don't know, because it's also tricky to balance, because like high fitness leads to better decision making, and it gives you more time to do things like that, and it makes you look smarter and whatever. Maybe you could like spend that time just absolutely drilling in combinations and stuff like that, and skipping out some of that extra kind of thing, so players know instinctively. Like, I mean, I can't give a personal comparison to a rugby league game, so I don't play rugby league and I never have. But I can say in a football context, like the teams that overemphasize fitness tend to be the rubbish ones, because they're the ones that have to run. Like there's a saying in football, let the ball do the work, you know? Like the good teams are knocking the ball around and they can turn up without having run marathons all week at training, because they know they can control the game and they don't have to run as hard. It's the team that's chasing after the ball that's doing all the work. And like I can tell you from personal experience, there's nothing more exhausting than being a lone striker and in a team that's like going to lose 5-0 or something like that. You're just chasing the ball across the back line the whole time. It's exhausting. It's just, yeah, it's an interesting balance, that sort of like, because then when you get those teams as well, it tends to be you lose. It's like, well, how can we get better? It's not like, well, we need to learn how to control the ball better with our first touch so we can take one touch instead of two. That's really bloody hard to do. It's the kind of thing, if by senior football you haven't learned it, you probably won't learn it in a hurry. Certainly not across an entire team. So the thing you can control is fitness and working harder and that kind of thing. So that tends to be the thing you focus on, and then that tends to be like just almost like fetishized to the point where it's, this isn't going to have this isn't going to make as much of a difference as it would to just put in one really good midfielder in there instead of someone who runs 15 Ks a game but can't control the ball if you pass it to them. Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? Like the way that kind of, because NRL is another thing we've talked about plenty of times with the NRL, is the rugby league old boys club kind of thing in Aussie. Like there's a lot of that as well, like just that kind of, and we get it here too with the way rugby's talked about, probably all sports because of this, but like just that kind of thing is you've got to work, yeah, like that's, again, probably a little bit of a fetish thing, is like you just got to work as hard as you can and put your head down and do your job and these kind of things, and maximum effort, and sometimes maximum effort isn't actually what you need. Sometimes like less than maximum effort allows you to do maximum result because of like just technical expertise or whatever, just being a little more pinpoint kind of thing rather than running your socks off. And it's just one of those weird things where the way it's talked about sometimes is perfectly accurate and completely right, and sometimes it's just kind of ingrained in the established way of doing things and isn't necessarily as true as it feels, or as true as we're told it is.
Yeah, like this is obviously impacted by like the content that I consume, but I never hear about an English Premier League team talking about how they've had the toughest preseason. I never hear about an NBA team saying how they've had the toughest preseason. I don't even hear about like Super Rugby teams saying, "Oh yeah, like we've had the toughest preseason we've had, and we're putting up all these big running numbers." Like it just doesn't seem to be, to use your word, fetishized as much as the NRL, which is an interesting thought. Like I find that rather interesting, and can obviously go back to the pokies and beers kind of culture of the NRL. Just one more note: Melbourne Storm. I'm not going to say that they've just like generally they've got one of the lesser, one of the smaller groups of injured players, as told to me by the NRL.com casualty ward. They've only got 4 players out injured right now, which is just a quick scroll, feels about average. Not too many teams have less than 4. Only a few teams have like 6, 7, 8. But Melbourne Storm, no knee injuries. So that might be purely coincidental, but you've got one team in the Melbourne Storm who have no knee injuries in their injured group right now. Then you've got a New Zealand Warriors team who have at least 5 knee injuries. So that's tells you a bit about what's happening, and that's actually something that might spark a little write-up for me, just assessing those injuries. We'll
they haven't
slide
been
over.
training on AstroTurf, have they?
I don't know.
Because that just seems like drastic.
Mate,